All right, if we can pick up where we left off. The Missoula Circles of Support has its outer circle, has its steering committee already up and running. Are there members of that steering committee here today? If you are, just hands up. The Missoula Steering Committee. Okay, I know that there may be one or two people in attendance. They may not be back from lunch yet. But that's how far along this organization is that it has begun to build its outer circle in its steering committee. So the project is in its launch phase. I wanted to show you quickly, traditionally, who Circles of Support has ordinarily worked with, and these can be used as screening criteria in terms of who gets a circle and who doesn't. What you'll find right away is that there are a lot of people who would like to be in circles, who volunteer to be in circles, and whose probation and parole officers and others say should be in a circle. So we need to sort of refine a little bit in terms of who gets a circle and maybe who doesn't, or who can wait until later. And so these are traditional inclusion criteria. First of all, the person should be a sex offender, high risk and or high profile. High risk, that's where the steering committee can be of assistance in terms of looking at risk actuarially, in terms of assessment, what is his assessed risk. You may find people that are high needs, but not necessarily high risk, although those two things usually go together. High profile may be somebody that the community is aware of. There may be public notification. I don't know if you do that here. But the community is usually pretty upset. Little or no means of positive pro-social support in the community. So if you've got somebody who is reasonably high risk, high needs, he's got, but he's got some good family around him, people that are going to, take care of him, make sure that he reports when he's supposed to report, has housing, etc. That's probably not somebody, at least in the initial going, that needs a circle of support and accountability. Somebody who is willing to take responsibility for their offenses. Now, this can be a little bit contentious in the sense that taking responsibility for their offenses is not necessarily a 100% given for guys that can be core members. So if somebody says, for instance, I was charged and convicted for molesting 5 children. I didn't do it. Okay, maybe one of those kids I got involved with, I can admit to that, but the other 4 are lying in their teeth. I didn't do it. Probably is enough to include that person in a circle of support. You've got enough there to hold the person accountable. So you admit that you have had problems with children in the past. In fact, you violated a child, but you're not admitting to all 5. Now, for a probation parole officer, for a treatment provider, that's not enough. And you may want to pursue that further in treatment or under supervision. But for circles of support, that would be enough to get the person into to a circle. For the person who says it's bogus, I didn't do it, never happened, I don't care what the judge said, I don't care what the court said or the jury said, I don't care what the kids or the family said, just didn't happen, not guilty, is somebody who's going to have difficulty being in a circle because there's not a lot there that you can hold that person accountable for. And that's probably going to be a treatment and or supervision issue. I'm not sure the person would be out in the community with that kind of a, if they're in that much in denial. But willingness to take responsibility for his offense or offenses, at least somewhat. Willing to volunteer to enter into a covenanted relationship with a circle and to do whatever it takes to achieve that bottom line of no more victims. So what is a covenanted relationship? And we're going to have a little bit more experience with that as we get into some of the exercises this afternoon. But basically we ask a person to sign on with a covenant to the circle of support and accountability, the core member and all of the volunteers. And basically the covenant says, here's what we're prepared to do for you in terms of support and accountability, etc. And here's what we expect of you in being in a circle of support and accountability. Things like if there's any court orders, supervision orders, et cetera, that you'll obey those. It's not a replacement or a de facto probation order or a supervision order. It's just here are the things that we promise to do as your circle of support, and here are the things that you promise to do as a core member. In some ways, like a behavioral contract, we like the language of covenant, and that it adds a certain depth to the agreement that is going to be there. Without the covenant, you don't really have a circle of support and accountability. That agreement has to be in place. Part of that covenant says, your core member may say, okay, well, so what? If you catch me smoking dope, you're going to report me to the probation officer? Yes. Oh. That may be a full stop for that particular core member. But anything that seems to be a supervision concern, a behavioral concern, that seems to be leading in the wrong direction, that is something that your probation officer, a parole officer, or a police officer may need to know about, is stuff that we're going to hit full stop on, and we're going to ask that you go talk to your probation parole officer and explain, what your behavior has been. And if you have trouble with that, then, we can go with you and help. And if you have trouble with that or you're not sure you're going to do that, then we're going to have to do that. And that has to be made explicit and clear right at the very beginning of the relationship, that we're not looking sideways for any kind of behavior that isn't on. It looks like it's going to be problematic behavior. Even if it's just attitude or something like that that's not improving or getting worse, or that the person seems to be withdrawing. We'll try to work with that in circle if it's not as a violation of law or violation of a protection, of a probation order or something like that. But if it becomes something that's problematic and the circle doesn't seem to be making any headway on, then maybe we will be talking with a probation or parole officer. That has to be understood right up front. In a sense, you use that covenant, you can explain this to your core member as your pact with the community. I'm going to come back and live in this community or try to live in this community, and I've made this covenant, this agreement with this group of people. Here's what I'm prepared to do, and here's what they're prepared to do while I'm in this community. And if that includes breaking the law or violating my conditions, well, that's just not going to work. So if you're a probation or parole agent, as the movie you saw with the police officers there saying, we would hope that if something is going wrong, that things are going sideways, that the circle members would come and talk to us and tell us what's going on, and vice versa, really. The circle can become a supervision tool as well, in a sense. That if you're having, as a supervision agent, difficulties with your guy that you think you might be able to resolve without, bringing the hammer down by using the circle, saying, would you talk to this guy and tell him that, he's running out of chances here real quick, and we're getting fairly fed up with him. That's happened. That happens quite often in that relationship. And sometimes the circle can really work, miracles where an agent may not be able to get it across so succinctly as a circle can, and vice versa. That relationship is something that you're going to have to get used to, and is going to be tentative, I think, at first until you realize whether your volunteers in the circle are trustworthy and whether they realize that they can trust you not to pull the pin on the guy just because he's done something in violation of his conditions. Where you get the opportunity to work with the volunteers, and we would encourage, and we need probation and parole agents to come and participate in the training of our volunteers so that they can understand what, how probation and parole works, what the conditions might be like, why those conditions would be there. And, if you're pulling the pin on somebody and sending him back to jail, why you would be doing that. One of the things that is most valuable for volunteers to learn is that they may have observed their core member having a drink. He may come to a meeting smelling of alcohol where there's an alcohol restriction. He's not supposed to drink. And they report that, or he goes to to a supervision agent and reports that, and think, I had a beer. Big deal. The parole agent, on the other hand, may be in possession of other knowledge or other information where it's not just a beer or one-time drinking. It may be the culmination of a whole series of things that is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And volunteers need to know that and know how that works. So your core member has to voluntarily be part of the circle and sign that, be willing to sign that covenant, and all the volunteers sign the covenant as well. So it's something that we all do together and are accountable to that covenant. Questions? The question that I might ask is, we're working some pretty high risk, some pretty manipulative, deviant guys here. Do you think they're going to volunteer for something like this? Aren't you talking about the low risk guys? Is that a question that you've been thinking of? I want to ask you another question before we go a whole lot further, just to get us thinking. How many people, honestly, straight up, taking a look at this is the kind of guy that we're looking to work with, and put this guy with community volunteers, how many people are having trouble with that concept? Really struggling with that concept? Okay. Anyone want to share what your troubles are? Why? What's going on? What are you thinking about? Anyone want to share that? No, not right now. No. Yes, ma'am, at the back there.
I would wonder, first of all, how long-term this would be for someone that to feel like they had supervision, another layer of supervision. Like, why would they agree to that? And if they had a negative experience with that, what would prevent them from just saying, I don't want to circle anymore? And then also, I would worry about with the community members, maybe hearing some retribution if they did turn them in for drinking or
And those are some good points, some good questions. So the question is, why would someone add another layer of what seems to be like supervision to something that they're already experiencing in terms of being with a probation or parole officer? Why would they put themselves in a little deeper with more eyes on them? And the second part of the question was, if I understood it correctly, is, so we find that someone's been drinking or doing something that is in violation of a condition or is worrisome, and we insist that that information goes to a probation or parole officer. What about retribution? Wouldn't he get kind of pissed off with his volunteers and sort of want to, get even? So those are good questions. In our experience, going on 22 years now, what would happen with a lot of the guys that I would interview is they'd ask the same thing. They would say, the hell are you talking about? I'm going to have a parole officer, breathing down my neck, and now I'm going to add 5 more people to do that. But as the day of release comes closer, they realize that coming back to community is not going to be simple. There's going to be a lot of stuff that they have to accomplish. There's going to be a lot of hostility in some cases. Maybe they need some friends. And of course, that's the whole idea of Circle and selling this Circle, selling it, I guess, explaining it to the core members that when you get back to the community, you're going to need some friends. You're going to need some folks who are going to help you find a place to live, get that job, stay straight. And we're willing to do that for you if you'll sign on with us. And lots of fellows will say, yeah, you know what, I'm going to need some support. Maybe I'm just going to use them to get a place to live, or to get that parole officer to back off and not pay so much attention to me, et cetera, because I got all you do-gooders hanging around and stuff like that, so it looks good. But as that relationship develops and deepens, you find that the core member is saying, I actually value these people. I'm not real sure why they're here, but I know they got my best interests in mind. And if I do anything, the last people that I would harm would be those folks, because they're just ordinary folks. I haven't had very many people like this in my life before, or all the people I did have in my life like this before are gone. This is my second chance. And core members tend to really learn to value that. The explanation of the covenant in terms of, if you're going to, if it's your idea to come back to the community and reoffend, or to jack around on your parole order or something like that, then you don't need to be in Circles. We don't want you in Circles. Go figure that out on your own, someplace else. Again, the relationship that is built between the volunteers and the core member is super important in terms of holding that person accountable. You can't hold somebody accountable until you've built that relationship, and that relationship has to be based on developing a friendship with that guy to the extent possible. And you say that to him, I'm willing, if you're willing, to extend a hand of friendship and see if we can get this done on, together. That seems to work. And I think you'll see in the film that's coming up this afternoon that expressed quite profoundly. The magic of circles, though, and this is the part that is really difficult to wrap our heads around. And after 20 years of working with volunteers and people doing circles in this country, in Canada, and other countries, the profound thing about circles is that relationship. And if you think about it, how did you get to where you are today without having friends, people that would support you, people that would hold you accountable when necessary? You couldn't do it. Remember the ethic that I was talking about before lunch, that one ethic that says no one does this alone? The core member can't do it alone either. And that, I don't know how to explain it any other way. We could use sociological terms such as building human capital, building social capital. That's what we're doing in the relationship in circles of support. That's what our evaluations tell us, is what happens in a circle of support, that we're building social capital here. We're building human capital for this core member. Okay, fine. I get a little fuzzy on those terms and get a little cross-eyed. I'm not real sure what they exactly mean, but I understand friendship. I think I know what that means because I've got some really good friends in my life, and I wouldn't be standing here today if I didn't have those friends in my life. And believe us or not, but it's the development of that relationship based on the openness to trust and transparency and friendship that allows us to demonstrate statistically that we can reduce the reoffending rate amongst this group by upwards of 75%. And we'll see those data towards the end of the day. Sir.
I have a question. It's kind of relating to the probation, but for someone trying to fully integrate back into society, is the prohibition of drugs and alcohol detrimental to the integration and stuff?
So the question is, for someone who's trying to integrate with society, is the prohibition from drugs and alcohol helpful? Or is it detrimental to someone's efforts to integrate? Well, I guess I'm going to have to qualify the answer by saying that depends. First of all, using drugs in most states, non-prescription drugs or drugs that are not prescribed, is illegal. So participating in illegal behavior is detrimental to entering society and integrating with society. If you're going to be breaking the law while trying to integrate with the community, then you've hamstrung yourself before you even got going. The other part of that is alcohol. Well, alcohol is legal, and I would answer it this way. And please jump in, and offer your own answers, or challenges. If alcohol was related to the crime cycle, if this person got into trouble with the law and ended up in jail because of alcohol, or that alcohol played a role in that, then I would suggest that alcohol is something that becomes a criminogenic need area and is a contributor to risk. The person is not as much at risk if they're not drinking, but when they drink, their risk increases. So in that sense, if it's related to their crime or to the crime cycle, consuming alcohol is detrimental. And finally, if you have a prohibition, a parole or a probation condition that says that you shouldn't drink, whether you agree with it or not, whether the core member agrees with it or not, that becomes the law for you as a core member. And if you drink or use drugs, then that's illegal and that's detrimental to your integration to society. I don't know if this is where your question is coming from, but sometimes we see drinking restrictions placed on somebody just because it's one of the kitchen sink things that's put in there because, well, you shouldn't drink either, right? And if you wear purple shirts, you're also going to jail. No purple shirts for you, right? Why? Well, because those kinds of conditions on probation and parole orders, I think, are unhelpful. At the same time, you can make the argument saying, you kind of want to keep your head about you.
I guess I was coming from a place where the person didn't have any kind of substance abuse or alcohol-related issues.
yeah, then I don't think that I don't think they're entirely helpful when they're placed on there. But that depends county to county, state to state, what the rules are. And you have to play, the bottom line is you have to play by the rules, you have to color within the lines, right? And if you've got a parole condition that says you can't drink when you don't have a problem or a substance abuse issue or something like that, well, maybe that sucks, but on the other hand, it's your behavior that got you here. And so you're going to have to just tough it out.
I think there are certainly times also when, I did stable and acute training in Ireland, which is a pub culture, right? If you meet anyone, if you're going to do anything, you're doing it in the pub. And they literally have a pub on every street corner. Believe me, I've been to a lot of them. And that's where stuff happens. That's where people meet, right? They're called pubs because they're public houses, places where people meet. And to have a blanket prohibition against drinking or being in a place that the primary revenue is from the sale of alcohol would limit a lot of the social interaction within that culture. So I think, at times blanket prohibitions might make some sense in some places, but maybe not so much in others. I'm not I think I've already shown my hand on this, in answering one of the questions earlier. I'm not a great fan of blanket application of something. Just because it sounds like a good idea, doesn't mean that it's a good idea for everyone. We have to be individualized. We have to be smart about how we apply certain tools. Given to the right guy, a certain prohibition is going to be awesome. Put on the wrong guy, it could be seriously detrimental to his being able to reintegrate with any community for that matter. So I think, does a guy who doesn't have a problem with drugs have the right to smoke marijuana in his basement like half of the rest of the law-abiding citizens? Or should he not be allowed to do that simply because he is, on the sex offender registry? And I guess there's something to say, shouldn't have engaged in the behavior. There are consequences that come with the behavior, but if we're going to manage the risk, shouldn't we do that according to the risk-need responsivity model, which would say, target the problems the guy has? If, smoking marijuana in the basement, as part of sitting watching a football game or hockey game or whatever, if that's got nothing to do with his involvement in crime, I suppose, yeah, it's illegal. Shouldn't do it in the grand scheme of things, but really, is that what we should be putting our efforts into? Is that the risk factor we ought to be managing? And I'm not sure it is.
Can I want to add something, but yeah, he asked you if it was detrimental. You said that it wasn't helpful. But my question is it detrimental?
I again want to qualify that and say it depends.
Okay, well, let's go back to, there's no alcohol in his offense, related to his offense.
Right.
So with that being the baseline, is it, I'll agree, maybe it's not helpful, but is it detrimental?
Well, I think it could be. I think if it's going to prevent this person from engaging in society in a way that is fairly normal and fairly reasonable to expect him to do, if he's got a job, he doesn't have a problem with alcohol. He gets his job, and at the end of the week, the guys go out for a beer at the end of the work week, and he can't go because he's got a drinking restriction that has absolutely no bearing on his risk factors or his criminogenic need factors. Then you're preventing this guy from participating in a social event that he should be able to participate in. Is that helpful? And that's detrimental.
All right.
Maybe not hugely so, but
we'll agree and disagree on that then.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You disagree? You don't think it's detrimental?
I think the problem is the word detrimental. Yeah.
What the hell do you use that word for?
I think I would also default to the unhelpful.
Yeah.
Or perhaps less than helpful. Or not fully helpful.
Right.
Where does one fall on that?
I'm sorry?
Go ahead and wade into that.
Okay. A person who has been convicted, again, it depends on what the sexual offense is, but someone who is struggling with his sexual behavior, probably I would say pornography is unhelpful. If it's something that leads him to the commission of further crimes, it's definitely detrimental. And in terms of is pornography good, is it bad, or anything, I'm not even going to go there, right? But the context here is somebody who has difficulty with their sexual behavior, which can cover a hell of a lot of ground. Engaging in questionable sexual behavior, such as viewing pornography, depends, right? How much is he spending? How much of his time is he spending looking at pornography? If it's a lot, it's probably not helping him any. It may even be detrimental. If it's child pornography, or if it's, about 98% of my practice is spent working with people who have problems with their sexual behavior, which covers a lot of ground, who also look at pornography an awful lot of the time. And as much as I don't like Patrick Carnes, if you look at a lot of pornography over a long period of time, often it becomes the images of, I'm going to get whacked here.
No, you aren't.
The images that you're looking at become younger and younger, and then it's barely legal, and then and now you're into an area that is very questionable and sometimes illegal. And I think I would not counsel any of my guys to go there. I would say I would do what what's his name says. Stop it. Is that as clear as mud?
So I might not agree entirely with his perspective.
Yeah.
So if we look at the research is unclear. And there are two general perspectives, that there are some people whose behavior can become more problematic with the use of pornography, and that there are some people whose behavior can become better with the use of pornography. The University of Hawaii, Milton Diamond, has done a fair bit of work that suggests where there is freer access to pornography, generally there are lower rates of offending, and that for some people who have had problems with kind of deviant sexuality, that having access to non-deviant pornography may actually help them shape in the right direction. So if you have someone who has a history of offending against children, has had some non-exclusive interests in children, and who want to orient themselves more towards adults, that building that sort of adult pathway via use of not the really abusive or wacky pornography, but stuff that's reasonably namby-pamby, if you know what I mean. You don't want to know what I like. Remember, I was the chief penis measurer for like 8 years. I've seen stuff that would turn everyone in this room's hair white. So, I mean, clearly, it was my job, like literally, 5 days a week, 9 to 5, to watch pornography while I was waiting to see if anybody got an erection from it. So I saw more pornography over a reasonably short period of time than any human being should ever have to. And I think with some fringes around the edges, I'm still a pretty ordinary guy. And this it gets younger and younger and younger. That's because I'm getting older and older and older, right? So I like women in a certain age range, and as I get older, it seems like they're younger, but they're really not. They're just the same. I'm the one who's older, right? So I'm not surfing for teenagers. I'm not, except for the ones that they call teenagers who are really like 28. That's different, right? So where was I going with this? So if on the other side, yeah, I'm too far down the road for the shovel thing now. On the other side of the coin, Neil Malamuth, forget what school Neil's at, but Neil would be of the perspective that what porn you use can shape your interests, and that we need to be a little bit cautious about the idea that porn can be helpful. I think, as I'm intentionally being a fence sitter. What I'm trying to say is that not everything applies to everybody. That you have to be intentional about this. You have to have some sense around what it is that you're doing. In my work with sexual offenders who are intellectually disabled, there's a certain point in their treatment where we provide them with sexually explicit materials to aid in their masturbation, right? We call them sexy pictures, you know. And you know, where there is an intentional clinical decision that's backed up by some, you know, prior involvement in treatment, and we know where this is going, and it's managed, and there are, you know, kind of clinical decisions made about it, we're okay with providing people who have intellectual disabilities with sexually explicit materials that will allow them to have a broader experience of their own sexuality. Given that most of them have very, very few opportunities for interpersonal sexuality, theirs is always or almost always going to be masturbatory. So, you know, speaking as a guy, sitting in a room with no stimulation, it's kind of difficult to do that masturbation thing, especially as you get older and, you know, your testosterone drops and whatever. You know, it's not going to be that easy. So having a little bit of something to help you get to that point, I think, is reasonable. Are we giving them, you know, like Hustler? Are we giving them the really hardcore foreign insertions, multiple partners, whips and chains stuff? Not that I have any big problem with that. If that's your kink, go for it. But, you know, I'm not sure that that's a reasonable thing to be providing our intellectually disabled offenders. So I think really it comes back to the need principle, and it comes back to the responsivity principle. What's going to assist your client in achieving your ultimate goal, which is to engage in sexuality in a healthy way that doesn't involve exploitation or, you know, hurting other people. If you can do that with some measure of, you know, sexually explicit materials, whether or not you want to call that pornography or, you know, kind of erotica or sexy pictures, whatever you want to call it, is, you know, up to you, I suppose. I don't think that it's always detrimental, and I also don't think that it's always helpful. So, there's the fence, and I'm on it.
But I think in both questions, what we come down to is that you know, and these would be discussions. These are the exact kinds of discussions that we might have with volunteers, and sort of saying, well, what are our expectations of our core members, and to realize that there is a lot of debate in this field in terms of sexual offender treatment, sexual offender supervision, etc. We don't know all the answers, and they can become pretty complex and let's not even introduce the feminist, well, we could, but we'll be here for a while, you know, about causing harm to people and who the subjects of pornography usually are, which adds another level of complication. But I think the bottom line of what we're really trying to say is that in terms of applying conditions to, for people to be in the community, because they've committed a sexual offense, doesn't mean that we're going to make a whole bunch of blanket rules based on a whole bunch of assumptions, most of which are going to be incorrect for that particular individual, and hope we get it right. That's sort of throwing as much onto the wall and see how much will stick with this guy before we send him back to jail anyway. That's wrong. That is unethical. Conditions need to be tailored by the, to the individual and in terms of what their offense patterns are. Treatment should do the same thing. It should target that person, that individual's risk, his needs, and his responsivity, his ability to be able to respond to whatever it is that we're trying to do. So there's no hard and fast rules. That's why I think you hear us saying, depends. Let's look at the situation. Okay, how many people are having trouble with putting volunteers with core members now? Are you? Oh, yes, you are. Okay.
Depends on the volunteer.
Depends on it. Can you see where we're having this? You get 30 people, and this is very typical. You get 30 people who show up for a volunteer training. They're all community citizens, etc. They've got a bunch of stereotypes running around in their heads. Maybe they've got a family member that they know about, etc. That has run afoul of the law, or has caused some sexual mayhem. Having these kinds of discussions with knowledgeable experts like yourselves, is a way of educating the public out there. Is a way of saying sometimes there just aren't, sometimes detrimental isn't a good word. Sometimes we can debate these sorts of things. We don't have all of the answers. But here's what we do know. and to provide that information and room for discussion. So what COSA is really set out to do is to substantially reduce the risk of future sexual victimization of community members by assisting and supporting released men in their task of integrating with the community and leading responsible, productive, accountable lives. Okay, have we beat that horse to death enough? But I want you to look at that mission statement and see what comes first. To substantially reduce the risk of future sexual victimization, that is the bottom line of Circles of Support and Accountability. How do we do it? By supporting released men in their task of integrating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're going out to talk about Circles of Support and Accountability, as I said earlier, don't lead with, we want to support sex offenders in the community, because you'll get thrown out of the room. Lead with, we want to fight against or work against sexual victimization and sexual violence in our community, and this is one of the ways that we can do it effectively. Sir?
I've been thinking about this question for a few minutes now, and this seems like a perfect time to bring this up.
Okay.
With regards to the fact, a well-known fact that a lot of people don't want to talk about is there's a great deal of sexual abuse that happens within our prisons, which adds to the traumatic psychology that can contribute to future offenses. My question to you is there any drive for these sorts of programs, these circles to exist prior to the incarceration of an individual?
For circles of support and accountability prior to the person committing an offense or going to jail, no. However, I want to point you towards a program. You can look this up on the internet. In Germany, they have probably one of the best known in the world interventions for people who would say, I'm experiencing arousal to children and I don't like it and I want to do something about it before this gets out of hand. The Dunkelfeld, and that's D-U-N-K-E-L-F-E-L-D, Dark Field, Dunkelfeld Project. Klaus Beer is the spearhead leader of that program. And they can do that because the reporting laws in Germany are different than they are in the United States. If you're a mandated reporter and you become aware of the fact that somebody has been involved with children or is having, especially in California, I think California has gone off the deep end on this. If I said to my therapist, for instance, that, yeah, I was looking at porn the other day and some images of kids came up there and, geez, you know, I found I was getting turned on by that, and that really, really bothers me. I need to talk about that. That service provider has to report that person to law enforcement, and that means the end of any kind of meaningful treatment, and I think that's wrong. But in terms of circles of support and accountability, in the model that we're describing here today, it has not been used prior to the offense. In terms of sexual abuse in prisons, yes. I think that imprisonment for many people is a traumatic experience. We don't treat, generally speaking, we don't treat former inmates for PTSD or any sort of residual trauma. We also need to realize, I think, that when we're talking about people who have sexually offended, when we go back to thinking about what Robin was talking about earlier about adverse childhood experiences, complex needs, et cetera, we're often talking to the victim and the perpetrator in one individual. And I think the good treatment these days, and certainly we want to make our volunteers and circles aware of this, that you can't simply discount the fact that somebody who has been sexually abused and has gone on to abuse, like the Charlie of the world. Not one individual who molested Charlie from the age of 4 until he died sexually was ever held to account for what they did to him. And I don't know how it is today. I don't know how it is in the state of Montana. It used to be that if I'm a sex offender and I'm in a sex offender treatment program and I said, you know, I think I'd really like to talk about what happened to me as a child, treatment providers would say, well, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about what you did to somebody else. And, you know, I don't mind saying, you know, point blank, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. That's dumb treatment, and that doesn't help anybody recover and go on to lead a good life or to accept responsibility for what they did. It's such an opportunity to do treatment with that individual, that passing it up is just like, you know, give your head a shake and go find another job, if that's what you're doing. That's strong enough?
I think so. I just wanted to add one thing, because I think what you're getting at is there a preventative aspect to circles of support and accountability? And I think there is, but I think it's a side benefit. It's actually one of the things that we tried to tap in the first evaluation. We did over and above looking at rates of reoffending between people who got circles, people who didn't. We also tried to get a sense of what the effects of being involved in COSA were for the stakeholders who were involved in it, and we had a separate sample of people for whom we had no reason to believe that they had any knowledge of circles or that they would have any sort of idea about what it was or what we were trying to accomplish. And we're trying to get a sense of how much trickle down there might be in the overall community where there is a circles project, whether or not he tells two friends, she tells two friends, they tell two friends, blah, 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 whatever. If we're doing training with our volunteers that helps them to have better and more realistic information about what happens with respect to sexual violence prevention, or what happens, in that whole, sex offending dynamic, if we're providing citizens with better information about that, are they then telling that to other people? So if they're at some dinner party or whatever, and the topic of some sex offender comes up, and somebody says, well, we ought to do blah, 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 and blah, and this person's a volunteer in a circle and says, well, what I've learned is that that's not actually the right way to do it, that we get better effects if we do X, Y, and Z instead, does that information trickle down? And does that lead to a general increase in the level of knowledge in the local community where there is a circles project? And then does that become instructive for people generally about being more mindful of situations of potential risk, in their midst? I don't think we have a full handle on that yet, but I can certainly tell you that those people who are aware of initiatives like COSA tend to have much more moderate views of how sexual violence should be managed in comparison to people who have no knowledge about COSA at all. So I don't think it's a kind of direct answer to your question, but it sort of speaks to the idea of, is there some, sort of migration of circles-friendly ideas in those communities where circles projects exist. The other aspect of it, and I don't think this is what you were asking, but I think it's an important point to make, we do make a concerted effort to identify our core members long before they get released, so that we can, so the volunteers can introduce themselves and start to develop some sort of a relationship with the core member prior to his release. The idea being that it's not like he walks out of the prison and all of a sudden he's got these 5 strangers who say, oh, by the way, we're your circle, come with us. It's a little more of a, sort of normal development process whereby those relationships get built over some time prior to the culture shock of walking out of the prison.
How much time?
Ideally 6 months. I don't know that always happens. There have certainly been times, in fact, in the original project in South Central Ontario, we've at times had members of the sexual assault squad bring a guy to us, drop us off at the door, and basically say, hey, this guy really needs you, and with no forethought or any kind of build up to it at all. Lots of times we'll find out a week or two before the person gets released. Sometimes we might get 3 months, sometimes we get a little more time. Ideally, I'd love to see 6 months. In practice, not so much.
And that then speaks to the need for other Department of Corrections folks here. Yeah, and I don't know what your Freedom of Information or your Official Secrets Act reads like in the state, but facilitating the meeting between a potential core member or people who might be core members as a group and the Circles of Support project is something that is one of the things that the steering committee is going to have to put their minds to and think about in being able to facilitate that meeting between the people on the outside and the people who are going to be on the outside who are on the inside. You had a question, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I'll buy you a beer. That's all I can do. Okay.
I forgot too.
Okay. Oh, shit. Okay. All right. Honey, I'll be home on Saturday. Okay. So there's a couple of slides in your pack here that we're going to skip and go to a film. I want you to see then this in practice, what it really looks like. This fellow, his name is Kevin. You'll meet him was a real Corps member. He is deceased. As Robin has a favorite of saying that we have a lot of Corps members who are dead now. Circles doesn't kill people, but it's been 22 years, and some people have passed on.
All set?
Yep. We'll discuss this. We'll discuss this later.
Again, we have authorization.
Sooner or later, most sex offenders are released from prison. Some have the support of family and friends. Others don't. The police and courts manage risk from the legal perspective. But to live responsibly in the community, offenders need much more.
I went to prison for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old boy, filming him, filming half a dozen other teenage boys. I did 3 years in prison for this.
The thought of meeting an adult male sex offender, I was terrified.
Over the years, I don't know how many boys I've done this to.
The purpose of the circle is to provide support for the Corps member. Equally important, though, the purpose of the circle is to prevent new victims.
I'm Kevin. I'm the Corps member of one of these circles of support. I have now been out for just under 4 years. I had a lot of problems in the beginning, and my circle was there for me. And this is my story about my journey with them. Hello. One of those weeks. It seems that's all I have is one of those weeks.
Did you know I live to hear the drama of your life every week?
Yeah.
I had a fight with my supervisor.
The other circle members, Carla's a criminologist, the go-getter in the group. She is the person who's never really satisfied with what I have to say. She's the one that really keeps me on my toes.
Then I have to take him out for lunch.
We're ready to move the office next week.
Roy is a supervisor with the city. Roy is kind of laid back, level-headed. Carla digs. Roy reinforces what Carla says in a more level-headed way, explains it out. Ian is a university professor. He's the intellect in the group who binds us all together after everything is being said and being done. Well, where would you like to start? Would you like to start with work, or would you like to start with the new person in my life? You're a sex offender in the criminal justice system, and you are down there with the scum. I didn't want to go back to prison again. When I arrived in the city, I was a sex offender who is into teenage boys, and all I can see are boys. Boys everywhere, and I'm just looking at them, and I'm just thinking to myself, well, what could I do with this person? What could I do with that person?
When the circle starts, there are lots of boundaries and barriers, and just with time, you slowly build trust both ways. It's done by not judging the core member, honoring commitments, being there.
My very first night out, I went out and I walked the streets. I saw people, I saw guys, and it was like I'm thinking to myself, it would be so easy. I could set myself up with this person. I could do this, I could do that. And it was, no, I'm not going to do that. Called up one of my circle members at about 11 o'clock at night and said, look, I need somebody to talk to. And it happened to be Roy, and he said, okay. He said, where are you? He said, I'll come and meet you.
If there is a crisis and the phone rings, somebody's got to be able to be there to help work through the crisis and talk things through.
He sat with me till about 1 o'clock in the morning, and we talked until I was calm enough to go back to where I was staying for the night and go to bed.
The accountability is a lot about trust, because as the trust builds, you can now start calling the core member on certain behaviors.
Over the years, I learned to be a regular con man. I learned to sympathize with these boys. I learned to know what they liked, what they didn't like. I was the guy that let them do things that their parents wouldn't let them do. They could come to my place, they could drink, they could come to my place, they could smoke. If they wanted to do drugs, they could do drugs. Sit down, watch a skin flick. My thrill was to find somebody and then get that person into bed. My thinking when I was in the prison system was, this is the life fate dealt me. This is what I'm going to be for the rest of my life. My psychologist, he helped me get over that. He made me realize that I'm the person who's in control of my own life, and I can steer it where I want to go if I'm willing to. And that was one of the reasons why I got into the circles of support.
Sarah, you mentioned a new person.
Yes, I have a new person living with me.
Oh, good, from the, what is it, the frying pan to the fire.
I have a friend. Edith is somebody that I've met through somebody else.
Edith?
Edith has a 16-year-old son. Every time I see Edith, I hear stories from Edith about the horror stories of her son. Well, in the span of a week, Edith kicked Bill out 3 times. Edith asked me if I would speak to teenage son. Bill and I have managed to talk and get to know each other over this period of time. So my suggestion was, well, why don't you stay with me temporarily until we see what can be worked out. I have, in my mind, said I'm not going to have sex with this person. I'm attracted to him, but I'm looking at it as just a short-term thing until I can get him reestablished. Well,
Intentions are great, but if I bring a big fat chocolate cake home and put it in my fridge and go, you know, I'm really strong. I don't need a piece of that chocolate cake. I know my weaknesses and my difficulties, so I don't test my willpower. And I think right now you're definitely doing that, Kevin, playing with fire. This is not a good situation for you to have a 16-year-old living with you. It is not, it's just not healthy for you. The circle, to some degree, acts like an extended family and acts like a friendship group for them. Our circle is very effective at trying to keep Kevin accountable to the best of our abilities. We don't try to be psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists. I think we just try to be good friends and with a good dose of tough love. Excuse my cynicism, but unless you're like the nicest guy in the entire planet, I just find it strange that you're taking on this responsibility. It's not yours to take on.
That's right. We developed the accountability by frank, open discussions. We were blunt, we were direct, we didn't candy coat anything.
I'm sorry, but what sort of ulterior motives do you have? My motives right now are strictly honorable. My thing is here is a boy who needs help.
It's not your job to save him. I mean, you can give him
We also
direction.
made sure by the end of it that we were also holding him up and allowing him to see his own good ideas to prevent relapses or to have a better way of doing it in the future.
So in other words, what everybody's saying is I should go home, tell him, pack his stuff up, and go. What do you think? I understand what everybody's saying and where everybody's coming from. Carl is forcing me to realize that, okay, although I'm not looking at him in a sexual point of view, I am looking at him that, yeah, I may deep down inside want some sort of, hey, thanks a lot, I really appreciate this from you. You keep justifying it to yourself, and you're lost. We justify it to ourselves that what we're doing is okay, but it's not okay. And once you realize that it's not okay, then half the battle is gone there.
You know, it's patterned ever since I've known you. Kid in trouble, he's running from the law, he's running away from home, he's on the street, I'm worried about him. I'll get him to live with me.
I told myself I wasn't going to be in this group just to be his friend, although I hoped I would become his friend. I have victim issues myself, and so as a survivor, it was important for me to make him accountable, for him to know what victims go through, and to try my best to make sure there wouldn't be any more victims.
It wasn't unusual for me to refer to a boy as nothing more than a piece of meat. I would be saying, oh yeah, I saw this cute little thing on the street the other day. You saw what? I saw this cute, you saw a boy the other day. You saw a boy, not it, not a thing, a boy. And they kept driving the point home. They weren't overpowering about it. They realized that this was a lifetime of habit that they were trying to break. And it wasn't going to happen overnight. And even myself, I didn't even notice when it did start to change. We've already set a deadline, okay, of Thursday, him going back home. Make it aware. This was a one-time thing. You guys are either going to have to make this or break this. If it doesn't work out, I am not there, okay, for the two of you to just keep shifting back and forth to my place.
The idea is to bring them into a space where they realize it's possible to live a life with a certain degree of mutual trust and reciprocity. You are there clearly articulating standards, but you're not there making judgments.
The work has eased up a whole lot because we don't have the crises that we had in the very beginning. We've reduced the structure a whole lot by not having weekly meetings. We just sort of evolved into Ian and I getting together with Kevin after church on Sunday, shooting a breeze. Kevin really needs to know that there's people there that love him unconditionally, that are going to stick by him no matter what. I don't think he's had a whole lot of unconditional love in his life.
They are my best friends. You can't share what we've shared and not become friends. If they weren't there, I'd be back inside by now.
And more to the point, there would have been more victims.
A lot more.
Any thoughts, observations? Yes, ma'am.
At what point do they take accountability for themselves so they don't
I think what you saw right at the very end there was what we would call a post-covenant relationship. The circle had pretty much disbanded. They decided that, you know, he's doing okay. But they'll get together for coffee every now and then and just, as friends will do, right? And so at what point depends, again, sorry about that word, but depends on the, you know, the circle, the needs, and everything else. You get some guys that are highly, very, very needy, don't ever want to let go of the circle, and other guys who can't wait to let go of the circle. What seems to be consistent, though, is that sort of relationship continues in some form or another. I had a fellow once who said to me, I'm done, been here for a year, don't need the circle anymore. And we had a celebration. We celebrate a lot in circles, right? All the accomplishments that a person would make. And we said, so let's have the post-covenant party, cake and coffee and all that. And we, you know, tore up the covenant and all that. And when it was over, we were packing up the tables and, you know, giving him the leftover cake and stuff. And he said, well, wait a minute. You know, I can still phone you guys every now and then, can't I? And that's what you're looking for, right? Is that relationship continuing in a less formal way after the circle is done? Average 1 to 2 years for that to happen. Sir, no, hold on, no, I'm into this guy's debt. Good.
I'm basing this question on the assumption of what you talked about earlier about high-risk guys maxing out and coming out without formal probation supervision, and this need being so intense for that particular group. So in Canada, it's obviously going to be different. Our guys here are either going to be paroling or coming out with suspended sentences, usually lengthy. So is that a correct assumption first before I finish the question?
So what he's asking is just a little bit of a comparison of how sentences get managed in Canada versus the United States. So keep in mind that the Circles Project started up in '94, and it was probably about 2 to 3 years after the law had changed that allowed the parole board to essentially max these guys out. Up until that point, as I had said, every single incarcerative sentence came with that you know, 2/3 in, 1/3 out. So built into the sentence was already that period of follow-up in the community, dependent on the severity of the offense, the likelihood that that person was going to need service in that last third. So, you know, I think from a planning phase, you know, kind of standpoint, it made a lot of sense to do things that way. When we then allowed the parole board to start detaining people until their max out date, that's when things started to get problematic. And we got those sorts of scenarios where guys like Charlie and Ray and also this guy, Kevin, could be released to the community with nothing. So in 1996, the federal government in Canada changed the law such that people who were where there was some anticipation that they would continue to pose a significant degree of risk post-sentence, even if they were detained, got what was called a long-term supervision order, which could be up to 10 years of post-federal sentence supervision. So earlier I said there's no such thing as federal probation. Post-1996, there was a variant that's kind of like federal probation. The idea being that the institutional component should be mirrored by an equivalent amount in the community. But the judges, of course, interpreted it as up to 10 years. So often what happened was they would get 2 years in and 10 years follow-up if they got maxed out. So it's true to say that much more often is a sex offender in the United States likely to be supervised for a much longer period post-release than would be the case in Canada. And you know, sentences here in the U.S. tend to be 2 to 3 times longer than sentences in Canada generally. So there's that aspect to it. So at the time that these films were made, and when we had our original guys coming out to Circles, Yes, indeed. These were people who were maxing out where the system was broken, where the government had not accounted for the likelihood that some really, really high-risk guys were going to get dumped on the community with nothing. It took them about 2 years to figure out that they'd screwed that up. In the interim, Circles of Support was really the grassroots response to that situation of risk, where where ordinary citizens said, well, this is untenable, we're not going to allow this to happen, we're going to deal with this on our own. So now it's reasonably, I don't know, what would you say is the number of warrant expiry guys who are going into a circle now, sort of percentage-wise, about a third to a half?
Oh, I wouldn't say half, no, I'd say more like a third to that.
Yeah, so we're now at a point where most of the guys who were at that high-risk, high-need level that we typically, target for a circle, those are the kind of guys who are going to get one of those long-term supervision orders. So they're likely to have a PO for anywhere from 2 to 10 years post-release. So it's not quite as bad as it used to be. But there are still situations in which, somebody who was not on the sort of judicial radar will get released to the community with nothing. The other thing that the government also put in place after COSA as well, and you heard in the first film, the officer with the kind of denim shirt talked about an order of prohibition. This is one of those peace bonds I talked about before, the idea, sort of akin to the kind of celebrity stalker idea. So it's a proactive thing based on fear. So if any person has reasonable cause to fear that someone poses an undue amount of risk to either children under a certain age or to adults, the police will be the proxy, will bring that person before a judge and make the case. If the judge buys it, then this guy goes on to an order. It's under Section 810 in our code, so we call them 810 orders. And used to be for up to a year, they could be held to certain kind of conditions, much like probation, much like parole. And if they violated those conditions, they could then be sentenced to some term of incarceration. I think long-term those 810 orders have now been up to a 2-year period, so they could be placed on an order for 2 years. The thing about those, however, is that with each passing period, it becomes that much more difficult to argue that the fear is reasonable if he's been on the order and nothing happened. So if he was on an order for a year and got through it fine, you could theoretically see him maybe be on get that order renewed for 1 year more, or maybe 1 year after that. But after 2 or 3 years, it becomes that much more difficult to say that the fear is still reasonable. So there are some stopgaps that do allow for that kind of thing in Canada now, but it's by no means like it is here. We have no such thing as lifetime probation in Canada. The only thing that would be akin to that is that, like here, life is life. So if you get life, you may get your parole eligibility will be determined by what sort of level of life sentence you got. We've got life 10, life 15, life 25, much like you folks have. And so if someone gets released to the community, they're still under supervision, but they're still serving that sentence. So it's not like they get violated, they just get sent back, and it's completely at the privilege of the, of the National Parole Board. That's the only situation where we would have anything akin to, that kind of lifetime supervision. So, what was the rest of your question?
That sufficiently answered the rest of the question. I mean, obviously,
okay.
And the other programs that are in place in the U.S. Have figured out how to work within the Department of Corrections with the existing system and supervision teams that involve therapists, probation officers.
Yeah. So in terms of that kind of collaborative approach, depending on where the Circles project is, it may or may not be fully integrated with the state DOC. Probably the most obvious example of a fully within the DOC example would be the state of Minnesota. Their MINCOSA project, all of the volunteers are volunteers for the DOC. All of the people who work in it, as like project coordinators, are all, Minnesota DOC employees. The core members are selected by the DOC. So this is an entirely top-down approach, whereas in Canada, at its beginnings at least, it was an entirely bottom-up approach. In the state of Vermont, they probably have the best, sort of hybrid aspect of that, where the funding and the structure comes from the Vermont DOC, but they contract with a number of their county community justice centers, and those justice centers are arm's length on contract to provide service. So the DOC will identify people who could potentially be in a circle. It's up to the CJC to determine who they're going to take as a core member and then to ultimately follow through with that. And they have a fair amount of actual autonomy in terms of how they can manage their circles. But the framework, is largely determined by the DOC. The difference between Vermont and the state of Minnesota is that Vermont is a very blue state. It's the Bernie state. So they have written into their law that where there is a restorative justice option, that option must be considered first. So they've actually written RJ right into their kind of criminal code. So it's a slightly different sort of circumstances.
Minnesota has notoriously been in the front lines of a lot as a result of their civil history. And so did the top-down approach evolve out of that?
So, okay. Yeah, so what Chris is asking is that the state of Minnesota has had some great difficulties with its civil commitment program. Interestingly, the civil commitment program is not run by the same agency that runs the DOC, so they're separate. The civil commitment program is run by Department of Health Services, Department of Health and Human Services. Fortunately or not fortunately, whatever, I was one of the Rule 706 experts hired by the judge to evaluate that program. I spent a couple of weeks on the stand in that case. The weird thing about Minnesota is that when it comes to their DOC, they're very forward-thinking. They have a comparatively small incarcerated population. If you take them and the state of Wisconsin, they're side by each and largely similar types of people. The state of Wisconsin disproportionately incarcerates people. The state of Minnesota does the opposite. Both of them have a civil commitment program. Wisconsin tends to release people fairly regularly. They have a relatively small civil commitment population. State of Minnesota has the second largest civil commitment population in the nation. And in fact, you'll remember I said before that most states who have an actual civil commitment program, the rate of civil commitment is about 2.5% to 3.5% of their sex offending population. It's over 9% for the state of Minnesota. So they disproportionately civilly commit people. And up until just very, very close to when Judge Frank decided that their program was unconstitutional, they had never unconditionally released anybody from the program. So the program had been in existence for like 20 years. They had never released anybody unconditionally. And at this point, I think there's only like 4 guys who have been released. So they just continue to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and their program costs about $75 million at this point per year. So I wanted to add a comment, and I know it's time for our afternoon break, but I wanted to add a comment about this idea of how long does a COSA last for? When we originally started doing this stuff, we really didn't know what we were doing. We were responding to a gap in policy that put the community at risk, and we were trying to be enterprising and come up with something that was going to try to fill that gap. We initially thought that our core members would come out, they'd get into a circle, they would be involved for a year or two, and that they'd be good to go, and they'd go back to the community and live their good life. And we were horrendously wrong. Most of the people who ended up coming to us were fundamentally broken. Guys like Charlie, guys like Ray, guys like Kevin, who had terrible upbringings, very deviant, very antisocial, to the point of being psychopathic. Kevin was a very troublesome guy. His sexual fantasies were so intensely deviant and so off-the-wall deviant that the psychologist that we referred him to for therapy used to call me for therapy after he had a session with Kevin, because it just the sorts of things that he was thinking about were that dark and that kind of troubling. So we thought that they'd be good to go and move on. Some of them have turned out to be that way. A small percentage go into the circle, they're there for a year or two, they get their feet on the ground and they move on. They still continue to make contact with their circle volunteers, but they've expanded their social circles to include other people. Whereas some people, like for instance Charlie, really never had a social circle outside of his circle. Those were his people. So, when we say that, we're trying to help them reintegrate to the community, or, integrate to the community, because I think in Charlie's case, he was never integrated in the first place. He found a community, but not the greater community. He had a social circle of maybe 20 or 30 people who were involved with circles of support, and that really was his bit. And just a very quick anecdote before we move on. As part of the first evaluation, I told you we did some process evaluation as well, in which we did interviews with volunteers, with members of the outer circle, with core members, and I wanted to do an interview with Charlie. Obviously, he's circle number one. It would be kind of a lousy evaluation if we didn't at least include him, right? So we needed to include him. And I was the one who was going to be doing the interview, and I worked for the Federal Correctional Service, so I worked for the man. And he refused to see me. He said, no, I'm not talking to that bastard. He works for corrections. He can go fuck himself, basically, was the language. And that was what Charlie was like. So I had to broker a deal to say, okay, what's it going to take to get me there? Do you have Tim Hortons here in Montana? No, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you've been to the East, Tim Hortons sells more fast food in Canada than McDonald's and Burger King combined. It's like a huge thing. He used to be a hockey player for the Leafs. You don't care. But so the deal was I had to get him like the extra large, I had to get him the extra large double coffee and the largest box of, what we call Timbits, which are basically donut holes. I had to buy the biggest size of those, and with those, he would talk to me for a half an hour. That was the deal. So I go to his place with his coffee and his little box of Timbits, and we sit down and I say, so, tell me about your circle. He says, what circle? I said, well, this is going well. I said, your circle of support. He says, I don't have one of those. I said, okay. What about Harry? What about, Eileen? What about all these other people who were like part of his circle? And I think this is what finally drove it home for me. He said, that's not my circle. Those are my friends. So he had made that transition from a group of people he was, in some respects, thrust into, or who had said, send them here because nobody else will take them, kind of the default, where his relationship with them had transitioned from being really intentional to having some degree of, kind of reciprocity. I don't know that Charlie ever fully believed that anyone in the world was there for any purpose other than to serve him. But the nature of the relationship that he had with his circle volunteers really, I think, transcended that fundamental narcissism that sort of permeated so much of the rest of his life. So I know there are other questions, but I do want to get us a break. Let's come back at about 10:02, and then we can start moving towards the finish line.